Can I do it? Can I? Yeah, fuck it. Someone's gonna fucking rush into me. And look at this, like just parked in the middle of the fucking road. And not even like, oh, I'll move out of your way now, and they give you the little wave. No, just gonna park in the middle of the road while I let people in the car. Like, didn't even bother to pull in onto the path. I'm just gonna take up this whole lane in front of oncoming traffic. I hate people. So let's explain that term. And the term this week is going to be Part 5 legislation. You might see Part 5 legislation being thrown around in news articles when it comes to new developments that are coming up. Whether that's in your area or it's just of interest because it might be in the city centre. To cut a long story really short, Part 5 legislation is a law that was released by the government that dictates that any land that is set for planning permission, which is over 0.1 hectare or 9 houses, 10% of that must go to the government for social housing at existing price rather than at development price. So what that means is, essentially, if a new apartment building or a block of housing is going up and it's over 0.1 hectare or it's over 9 units, if it's 10 units, one of those units has to go to the government. If it's 100 units, 10 of those units have to go to the government for social housing. There are exemptions to this. The obvious exemptions are, if it's under 9 houses, or if, it's under 9 units, or if it's under 0.1 of a hectare. That percentage used to be an awful lot higher. It was as high as 20%. But in 2015 that was brought down to 10% because it used to be part of the legislation that developers could actually buy their way out of creating the social housing necessary for it to comply with Part 5 legislation when they were building their units. Another interesting part about Part 5 legislation is that it is also up to the local authority as to how much of a percentage the particular development will give to the government for social housing. So if, say, 250 apartments are going up, but the developmental agency has agreed with the local authority to only give, say, 5% of that, then that's what the agreement is. It's up to 10%. It's not actually 10%. If there was 100 units, it would be exactly 10 units that goes to the government. This can actually be negotiated. It is up to that amount. Part 5 legislation was brought in because they wanted a good kind of socio-economic mix of people in developments that were going up. So this would kind of ensure that there was no classism involved in certain developments, and that people who are on the social housing list could avail of more high standard apartments that the government provided that were just built by a higher standard developer. So it sounds really good on paper, right? We could ensure that there would be mixes of all people in larger developments. However, there is a bit of a catch-22. Like I said, it does sound lovely on paper, but what the real issue with Part 5 legislation is that it still offers these units to the government at a price, and that price is extortionately high because of the very high development costs. And that's why essentially the government can't afford to purchase an awful lot of apartments and units and buildings that were created under Part 5 legislation. So on paper, this all seems like a really good idea. Different people from different socio-economic backgrounds all living together in the same place, which at the heart of itself is what Part 5 legislation is about. However, in practice, this doesn't always work, particularly when the cost is far too high, which is an issue that came up earlier on this year when the Phase 3 of Clancy Quay was completed. So upon completion, the government were to purchase a certain number of units from the new Clancy Quay apartment complex that has gone up earlier this year, finished by Kennedy Wilson, which is a construction company and investor which had built an awful lot of Clancy Quay. In order for the government to purchase just a one-bedded apartment from this particular complex, it cost over 400,000 for social housing. In context, the Society for Chartered Surveyors of Ireland earlier on this year released a report to see how much the construction costs were for a single-bedded apartment or for any housing construction in Dublin in particular. The cost of building a single-bedded apartment for social housing is about just under 100,000 or about 99k. And then for a house, between the amount of bedrooms, where it's built, can cost anywhere from 180k to 230. So in context, we actually could have had 2 entire houses out of that 400,000, or we could have had 4 one-bed apartments instead of just a single one-bed apartment. And this is where Part 5 legislation, while on paper is a good idea, actually in practice is not that much of a good idea, considering that development costs is so high. So let's go back to scary statistics again. And I realised that my figures for my scary statistics last week were actually incorrect. I get my figures directly from the Focus Ireland website. They publish, usually at the end of every month, they will publish figures for the previous month. However, the last figures that they have are for June 2020 on homelessness in Dublin. So as it stands in Dublin, since June 2020, there are over 6,000 homeless adults in Dublin, and there are over 2,500 homeless children in Dublin. If that doesn't frighten you, I don't know what does, but that's nearly 9,000 total people who are in emergency accommodation. There was 92 people sleeping rough who couldn't get homelessness accommodation or emergency accommodation. And since June 2020, in Dublin alone, there's nearly 30,000 households in total on the social housing list. Overall across the country, there's about 70,000 households which are currently on the social housing list. Sometimes it is taking people as long as 12 years just to be socially housed, which, as far as I'm concerned, is an absolute joke. And it is just because there's not enough social housing to go around, which, again, the current government's target is 50,000 social housing units, or there's absolutely no way we are going to be able to house everybody who needs it. Now, don't get me wrong, people on the social housing list can absolutely have a change in circumstances. They might get an amazing job which affords them the massive amount of income which is necessary to be able to afford a house or a home or an apartment or whichever. And if that happens, then they're off the social housing list, and therefore the social housing list gets that much smaller, and that's great, good for them. But this isn't going to be the case for everybody, and ignoring this or not doing enough to combat this personally is where I really take issue with. Does that mean I don't have faith in the government? It remains to be seen. This current government has only been in power for a very short amount of time, and the current housing minister does seem to be very enthusiastic about fixing these issues. However, his target to me just seems way off. And now I guess I can do like social housing news. I don't have an awful lot to talk about this week. There's a couple of kind of minor things. One of them is that there will be no affordability cap for getting affordable housing. So the difference between affordable housing and social housing is that the affordable housing model is offered to people who probably already have a deposit for a home, but they can't get themselves into getting a mortgage because they simply don't earn enough. This is kind of a shared equity scheme between the person purchasing the home and the government. So essentially the government purchase a little bit of it for you, but you owe that money back, which is what they did a couple of years ago, but it saddled an awful lot of people with massive amounts of debt. And the affordability cap, I think, between a couple was about 75,000, but now there's not going to be a cap. So anybody who wants to can go ahead and apply for this affordable housing scheme. In some ways, I think it's a great idea for people who are really finding it that difficult to getting themselves into getting a mortgage and securing that mortgage. I think it is a good idea, but I think the affordability part of it is a bit of a misnomer, because what's affordable for a couple who are earning over 75k is certainly not affordable for an awful lot of people and for an awful lot of couples. I can understand why they're doing it, however, I just don't see the point of calling it affordable when it isn't. Before Golfgate happened, Sinn Féin had an announcement that they were going to be releasing their initiative or their answer to the Land Development Agency. So there was it was up on the Sinn Féin website and on Sinn Féin Twitter, and Owen O'Brien had retweeted it, which caught me onto it because I follow him on Twitter. And I'm not too sure what they mean by the answer to the Land Development Agency. I guess we'll find out next week, and I can talk about it a little bit more next week. But it does seem very interesting. Owen O'Brien personally is an awful lot more ambitious when it comes to the building thereof and the planning thereof of social housing. I know he's been called out before because his mathematics around it can be a little bit iffy, but I have read through a lot of his proposals, and I guess I'm not the best person to speak about this because I actually don't know an awful lot of the legalese around it, and I tend to just believe what is put in front of me without really knowing the context. But I think his idea around how he wanted to go ahead and afford more social housing was that with the pandemic we could actually borrow from the European Union at pretty much 0% interest, so now was the time to borrow, and that was how it was going to be more affordable. However, that's not what the current government has actually done, and we're still trying to reach that target of 50,000 social housing units, I think, in 5 years. So I'm very interested to see what exactly their answer is to the Land Development Agency. It'll certainly be enlightening, I hope. But yeah, I guess we'll see next week. This week I was contacted by a representative from Sinn Féin, an absolutely lovely woman who I won't put on blast on the internet, because I had sent them a letter about my own housing concerns a little while ago, and she was just touching base with me to see how everything was. We had a really pleasant conversation and also a very frightening one, because there really is no way to help the current situation that I'm in, unfortunately, but they would keep in contact with me to see how everything was going. There was absolutely no push to join the Sinn Féin party, which was nice because I have absolutely zero interest in party politics. It makes no difference to me. Although I will say that I contacted a vast number of politicians about my own housing needs, and so far only 2 representatives have gotten back to me. I contacted people from Fine Gael, I contacted people from Fianna Fáil, I contacted Sinn Féin, People Before Profit, Social Democrats. I'm not going to bother with Green Party, because they don't actually really, sorry, this is a really bumpy road, they don't really take much interest in housing as far as I can see. I had also contacted the Labour representative Aidan O'Riordan just because I enjoy how he yells at people in the Dáil, and I really tend to appreciate how he speaks about an awful lot of issues. Do we really need more fucking offices? Honestly, like, how many offices do we need? And loads of people not going to be working from home. How much fucking hot desking do you need around Dublin? Do you know what we do need? Fucking housing. There's no real point in getting angry about shit like that though, because it's not up to the developers to deliver housing at this point. They're just going to deliver whatever they want to. I also contacted some Labour TDs, and so far only 2 representatives have gotten back to me. One from the Social Democrats and one from Sinn Féin. And it's really reinforcing the idea within me that the current government actually doesn't care. Now, as I said, I'm going to reserve judgment because I haven't seen what they're really going to do yet, and I am excited that the new housing minister does seem to acknowledge an awful lot of the issues that I keep bringing up, the main one being that there's just not enough single bedded apartments, and there's so many single people on the housing waiting list and in emergency accommodation, and it's just because we don't have enough units to be able to house these people. But you cannot deny that 40% of people on the housing waiting list are single, and they are a massive part of it. They need to be housed. Everybody on the housing list needs to be housed. And the fact that it has gotten this bad is really telling. And you would think that with Part 5 legislation, as I talked about earlier, that this would have helped. But in fact it hasn't. In fact, an awful lot of developments were left unfinished. And the government has spent an extortionate amount of money on purchasing units that were built under Part 5 legislation that could have gone to building more social housing, as I discussed. It's the same problem that I see with HAP. Now, I have no problem for people who use and need HAP. I have gotten my documentation to say that I need HAP, and very soon, hopefully, I'll be able to start renting. And I'm going to, call every single agent that I know, and I'm going to irritate every single landlord that I know with my forms if I have to, because I need a place to live. But essentially, HAP is the government paying a private landlord or developer for something that they could provide, which is social housing. It's an enormous waste of money. And when you think about the amount of people, 70,000 households nearly on the social housing waiting list are all entitled to HAP. So that is 70,000 households that the government is currently paying for, instead of just building the social housing, which to me is completely ridiculous. Now it feels like they've dug themselves into a hole that they couldn't possibly budget their way out of at this point. Regardless, my point is that I was contacted by a member of Sinn Féin, one of the representatives, and we had a lovely conversation. However, what they told me over the phone, which really frightened me, when I brought up the idea that there's 70,000 households on the housing waiting list, I was told, well, it's actually closer to 100,000, because there's also an awful lot of non-profit organisations and co-op organisations who have people on their waiting lists. So when you incorporate all of them, everybody who is entitled to social housing, in a sense, can't get it, is closer to 100,000. And I nearly got sick, because that's nearly, if you, let's say there's 2 to 3 people per household, that's nearly 300,000 people on a waiting list. It's still an awful lot of people, all waiting for housing. I really try not to be completely disgusted at how housing has been handled, but I can't. My life has been badly affected by it. I know tons of people who have been badly affected by it. I know people who have ended up couch surfing. I know people who have spent a few nights out on the street. I know people who it hasn't affected at all. But they feel affected by it because they're the ones who have to walk through the city centre and feel powerless at the amount of people who are so desperate. I don't know what to do anymore other than this. And I guess volunteering. And just researching it as much as I can and trying to keep people informed. I know this is a little bit shorter than the video I had last week, but I think I just had so much to talk about last week that I went off on a big ramble. I hope this one is a little bit more coherent than my video last week, because I think I touched on just too many topics. Thank you for listening. If you know anybody who's confused about Part 5 legislation and they want to know more about it, just send this video on to them. And I hope this has helped you understand a little bit more about the current housing model in both Dublin and Ireland. So remember to stay safe. For God's sake, wear a mask. And if you can, volunteer at your local shelter or volunteer with your local homelessness charity, because right now this problem isn't getting any better. guess I'll see you all next week.